So, good afternoon. Today I want to talk to you about healthy soil and healthy soil biology. And to begin with, I want to discuss why it's important to talk about healthy soil and what's important about the biology that's in the soil. So we're going to start off with taking a look at the fact that we actually have a major issue in agriculture. The fact is that we're having to feed more people and fewer farmers. And as our population continues to grow, that's going to continue to be a rising issue. And on top of that, for most of our food production system, it's very resource intensive. We use a lot of synthetic fertilizers in our food production system. We're using a lot of irrigation, and we're using a lot of pesticides. But there are alternatives to these practices. However, if we continue on in the way that we're going to result in a continuation of some of the issues that we're just beginning to see. We're going to continue to have issues with eutrophication, where we're losing some of the synthetic nitrogen that we're adding to the soils, and that's getting into our lakes and our rivers and our streams and causing algal blooms that are creating dead zones, such as in the Gulf of Mexico. We're also seeing issues with nutrient use efficiency. If you look at these graphs, the top graph actually shows the global cereal yield, and since 1960, with modifications that we've made in production systems, as well as breeding programs and genetic modifications, we've seen an increase in global cereal yield, but the consequence of many of these practices that we've done is that we've also increased over the same time the usage of synthetic nutrients. In fact, it is found that roughly 30 to 50% of the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer that is applied is actually used by the plants. The rest of it will run off, will leach into the groundwater, or will go back up into the atmosphere as a very dangerous greenhouse gas called nitrous oxide. For phosphorus fertilizer, it's only about 30% of the synthetic phosphorus fertilizer that's added that will actually find its way into the plant. You can see these issues with fertilizer use in the bottom curve. This curve is actually a nitrogen use efficiency curve. It's over the same period as the top curve. But what this curve means is it is the yield per the amount of nitrogen that's used. And so what this shows is that we are actually using more nitrogen today to grow a bushel of grain than we took in 1960. And the other thing that we're seeing is that we're going to see these long periods of climatic uncertainty. NASA predicts that we're going to have decades-long mega droughts in our future. We're going to have these increasing areas of dry land systems where we're going to have to build up resiliency in our systems in order to be able to thrive. And soil health and soil biology is a big part of being able to build up that resiliency in the systems. So what we really want to do is we want to improve nutrient use efficiency, and we also want to improve water use efficiency. Research has shown that if you increase porosity, that's the open space in the soil, the space between soil particles, if you can increase that porosity by 45%, you can increase the infiltration rate of the first inch of water by 167%, and the second inch of water by 650%. So you can really get more when you have these heavy rainfall periods. You can get more water into the soil at a much faster rate and not have as much topsoil and nutrients lost by runoff, that you would actually have that water that's going to be able to percolate into the soil and be held between rainfalls. You're building up resiliency in the system. As you increase the amount of organic matter in the soil, you can increase the water holding capacity. And as you look at how you're going to be able to manage nutrition, you can actually have the plant utilize less water. So in a study that was conducted in the 1950s, Dr. William Albrecht found that for unfertilized corn, it took more water and produced far less grain than when you had fertilized corn. So that fertility became a key. But again, it doesn't have to be the fertility that you add through synthetic nutrients. It's the fertility that's the key, that is the fertility that's added throughout the growing season that's going to be enhancing the productivity of the plants throughout that season. Now, if you can manage water much more efficiently, get that water into the soil much more quickly, you're not going to have issues with flooding as we saw in 2008, and as we're continuing to see pockets of flooding continuing to happen as we've had these climatic uncertain events. We're also not going to see these issues with drought that we've seen occurring as well. So we're going to be able to build up these resilient systems that are going to be able to thrive, whether you have too little precipitation or too much precipitation, or certainly when the precipitation doesn't all fall at the right time. Now, the other thing that we're seeing as we build up soil health and have healthy soil biology is a reduction in erosion of our topsoil. It's estimated that in the US, we lose about 2 billion metric tons of topsoil annually. And this number hasn't really decreased since about 1997 or 1992. We got a shift that occurred as we went to more conservation agricultural practices. But after that, we now need to see sort of a revolution in what it is that we're using for many of our practices in order to be able to continue to see this next shift. So although this graph only goes to 2007, I've seen data from about 2012 to 2014, and we're still seeing roughly around 1.7 to 1.67 billion metric tons of topsoil that we're still losing on an annual basis. So we're still losing a significant amount of our topsoil because of the way that we're managing our crop production systems. And this is the end result that you'll see. If you look at these pictures, basically it's very difficult with just looking at the dust clouds to see the difference between a dust storm that occurred in the 1930s and a dust storm that occurred in 2012. You see that if it wasn't for the houses, you actually wouldn't really be able to see by the dust clouds the differences in the loss of soil. And we said after the Dust Bowl era in the 1930s that this was never going to happen again. But here we are again experiencing these huge dust clouds that are happening. And these dust clouds are not just visible from the ground, but they're visible from the air as well. This is in Washington State in 2009. Dust clouds that you can see both from the ground as well as in aerial pictures. And you also can see dust clouds from space. This was taken from by an astronaut from the space station. The dust cloud coming off of the coast of Africa. So you can see that it really is important in how we maintain our soil in our agroecosystems so that we're not losing this topsoil, that it's not going to be blowing away. We're not losing that valuable source of fertility and productivity in our systems. This is another dust cloud that you can see in radar imaging. So you can see the storm in the Midwest and the dust cloud that's following that storm. So as the winds turned up, the storm weather turned up the winds and the rainfall that happened, and then you have a dust cloud that's actually following along behind that. So it's really significant in what it is that we're being able to see in this loss of soil. And it's something that we really need to be starting to figure out ways in which we can address this. We can't afford to continue to lose 2 billion metric tons of topsoil every year in our crop production system. We're also seeing issues not just with wind erosion, but also with rill erosion or water erosion. You can see these gullies that were created in Missouri. You can see this from an aerial picture again with the water running off of crop fields and into the river. And that's going to end up resulting in areas like Minnesota in 2012, where you have these hillsides that the tops of the hills are basically denuded, that you've taken the topsoil away from those hills. And in North Dakota in the winter time, you have actually this combination of soil and of dirt, actually, and snow, and they call it snert. So you've gotten this soil that has blown off of the crop fields. It's now become dirt. It's fallen into the ditches, and then we now have snert. And it actually takes longer for that snow to melt under the snert than it would if you would just have regular snowfall. So it's very important not only to just keep that soil in place, not have it blow off or run off and turn into dirt, but to remain soil and remain part of that healthy system that we need to have. And if you have a healthy system, again, you have much more resiliency in the system. This is a picture from a farmer in North Dakota where we had a rainfall event where there was 13 inches of rainfall in a 24-hour period. And this is what the soil looked like the next day. This is his fields the next day. How many people could actually say that they could absorb 13 inches of water in a less than a 24-hour period? So these are things that we can do if we were to enhance the health of our soil, if we were to build up the healthy soil biology, get that to be much more active in our system. And it's very important to be addressing these things because, as you can see, then you're going to be creating a system in which not only you're going to be able to keep soil in place, but you're also going to create a system in which that's going to drastically impact crop yields. So here is from the Farming Systems Trial at the Rodale Institute. Rodale Institute is located in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, and this was after a period of drought during the early 1990s. And basically what we ended up seeing here was that the conventional system is not responding well to the drought, but the organic system is thriving under those drought conditions. And you saw that that system had up to about a 30% higher yield as a result of that thriving under those drought conditions. We saw similar evidence again in the Farming Systems Trial in 2015. Basically here what we saw was this was an issue not just due to soil moisture, but as Dr. Albrecht found, this was an issue that was also due to nutrient stress. So in our conventional fields, there was plenty of synthetic phosphorus and synthetic nitrogen was available to the crop plants. But in the spring, we had some excessive rain, and that allowed for the nutrients to run off or leach through the soil profile or become unavailable, either going up in the atmosphere as a gas or getting bound up in the soil profile. And then in the late summer and fall, when it was very dry, there wasn't any nutrients available to the crop plant to help to fill the seeds. And so we had a much less yield, much lower yield in those fields as compared to the organic system. These pictures were actually taken on the very same day. So you can see that in the organic system, the organic corn is still lush and green, whereas the conventional corn is turning brown. And so we saw that in 2015. We saw it again in 2016, that same type of an issue where we have these stress periods. Now, this isn't to say that this is going to happen every year. It does depend on precipitation patterns, but we can't predict the weather. And so we need to build up resiliency in our systems. We need to make sure that we have these systems that are going to be able to thrive and respond to the climatic uncertainty that we're seeing. So one of the questions that we have, one of the things that we're trying to find out is how much soil actually is there? How much soil do we have, that precious resource, in order to be able to grow the food that we need to grow for our expanding population? So not only are we seeing an issue with the fact that we're having fewer and fewer farmers, but we also have less and less soil. So if you want to think about an apple as representing planet Earth, and if you run the numbers come up to be almost perfect as far as being able to see if this case is true. So what we have here is we have the apple representing planet Earth. And as we all know, roughly about 3/4 of the Earth is covered by water. So we're going to get rid of 3/4 of our apple. We're going to be left with 1/4 of the apple. We're going to take that 1/4 and we're actually going to cut it up into 8 individual slices. Each of those 8 pieces are going to represent 1/32 of the original apple. Now, if we think of that 1/4, that still looks fairly significant. If that 1/4 was the soil that we had to be able to grow food for over 7 billion people, maybe it wouldn't be such a concern. But the reality is that although 1/4 of our planet may be land, not all of that land is available to be able to grow food on. So we're going to take 4 of those 8 slices away, and we're now left with 1/8 or 4 of those 1/32 slices, 1/8 of the original apple. And what we take land away from is we have land that's covered by snow and ice or deserts. It's not land that's available for being able to grow food. It's land that we're not going to be able to have and utilize as this resource for being able to grow food. Now, in addition to that, we've got other land that's going to be covered by things like swamps and forests and mountains. And although we might be able to grow some food in the forest, it's not as productive as much of our cropland is. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take away 2 of those slices for land that we're going to lose to mountains and swamps and forests. And we're now left with 1/16 of our original apple. Now, we're going to look at those 2 slices, and we haven't talked about land that actually provides for land that's used for buildings, for the over 7 billion people to live in, for schools and shopping malls and grocery stores and all of those types of things, and roads to be able to get from here to there. And so what we're going to end up doing is we're actually going to lose one of those 2 remaining pieces of the apple to land that's going to be utilized for urbanization or for people. So we've got 1/32 of our original apple. And this may look like a fairly substantial amount of soil, but when we think about an apple as representing planet Earth, we can't actually grow food on the core of our planet. It really is the skin of the apple or the very surface that provides the landscape for being able to grow food. So what we're going to do is we are going to peel that 1/32 of an apple. And that's all of the soil that we have to be able to grow food for over 7 billion people. So when you think about the soil as a precious, precious resource, this is what it is that you need to be thinking about. Is this tiny, fragile skin that we have. That's all that's available for us to be able to be growing food. And this is not a resource that's going to continue to expand. It's actually a resource that as population numbers increase is going to continue to shrink. And that's going to continue to put more and more pressure on us to be able to grow more and more food in a decreasing landscape. So we need to continue to come up with innovative solutions in order to be able to address those issues. So when we think about the soil, and we recognize now that understanding and recognizing soil and soil health is hopefully something very important that you recognize, and that it's something that's very, very precious, and we don't have very much of it. But what really is soil? How is soil formed? Well, back in 1941, Hans Janey put together what are called the soil forming factors. And these soil forming factors are climate or weather, potential biota, biological activity, relief or topography, parent material, and time. And when soil was first formed, it was the erosion of this mineral rock environment, the parent material. It took a very long time and depending on the topography, the slope, the landscape, that would impact how easy it was for that parent material to become eroded. And obviously climate, weather patterns would impact the levels of erosion of that material, the breakdown of that parent material over time. But you had the potential biota that actually is the thing that transforms soil into soil. Soil itself is organic, it's living, it's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. You need to have those three elements together in order for soil to exist. So when you have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen together, you can create soil in that environment. You can't create soil from methane. Methane is carbon and hydrogen. You can't create soil directly from carbon dioxide. That's carbon and oxygen. You can't create soil directly from water. That's hydrogen and oxygen. But the plants will actually transform carbon dioxide and water into sugars that are the building blocks of soil. The soil is this organic fraction. And so you can't have soil without having plants or without having some sort of photosynthetic activity. And so you don't have soil without plants, and you had no land plants without having fungi. The relationships between soil and plants and soil biota existed before we even really had soil itself. So you started off about 400 to 500 million years ago with this relationship with soil fungi, Arbuscular Mycorrhizal Fungi, that you can see in these pictures here. These images are actually fossilized roots, inside fossilized root cells. So the image at the bottom, you can see sort of the outline of the root cell wall itself. It's sort of a circular cell wall. And inside there, you can see hyphae. You see a strand that's bridging the two cells together. And inside there, then you can see these highly branched, sort of fuzzy cotton ball-like structures. You'll see these cotton ball-like structures in the upper image. And that's the highly branched threads, or the hyphae, the threads, the body of these fungi. And what these fungi do is they will have these highly branched structures called arbuscules inside the plant roots, but they also will go outside of the plant itself and form highly branched structures to be able to grab onto nutrients and water. And in the aquatic environment, before we had soil, before you had land plants, you had single-celled algae and cyanobacteria that would create this relationship with the fungal hyphae, and the fungi would go out into this aquatic environment and acquire mineral nutrients that the plants needed, or the algae and the cyanobacteria needed in order to be able to do photosynthesis. That photosynthetic reaction required these other nutrients that the fungi would be able to go out there and get. And that became very efficient at getting those nutrients at a higher level. So that the more nutrients that those bacteria and those algae could get, the faster they could replicate, and the more of them that there were. And then they would wash up onto land, and as they washed up onto land, they started to wash up on top of each other, and then they would start to build up into a multicellular type of material so that they could access more sunlight. The whole idea is to reach out closer to the sun. The easier it is for you to reach out to the sun, the more efficient you are going to be at conducting photosynthesis. And the more efficient you are at being able to get the mineral nutrients you need to create the proteins that are necessary for doing photosynthesis, the better off you're going to be. So what we have in the soil, after you had this relationship where you had these fungi and the bacteria and the algae, and they would wash up on shore, and then they would combine with the eroded parent material and start to create soil. And so you've started to create the soil environment. The soil environment we've divided into various types of horizons. You have the A horizon, which is usually the darker, it's usually a dark brown to black type of material. And that's where most of the biological activity is occurring. And then you have a B horizon, which is sort of the in-between zone between the A horizon and the C horizon. The C horizon is that parent material, that mineral component. And so the B horizon, you'll have various types of interactions with some of the mineral components, as well as some of the organic components, actively working in that environment. And in some cases, you'll have what's called an O horizon. And the O horizon is essentially an organic horizon, or it's not very well broken down plant material. So you'll see a lot of, it's kind of like very humus types of material that would be on there. That would be part of your O horizon. But again, most soils are going to have an A and a B and a C horizon. And what we want to do is we want to actually increase the depth of the A horizon. We want that to go deeper into the soil environment, deeper into the B horizon. And that's going to be able to build up organic matter and build up most of the activity. Most of the activity, most of the function of the soil comes from what's occurring in that A horizon. So soil is this nexus of chemical, physical, and biological activities. You have the soil physical structure, the open space, that porosity, the space between solid components, and the open space that's there that allows for water and air to move in and out of the soil environment. And you have the chemical structure to soil, the nutrients that are there, the various types of cations and anions that are going to be able to interact with the biological and the chemical, the biological and the physical components. And then you have the biological components. You have the different types of organisms that are there. And they're all interacting with the soil organic matter, with that organic soil component. It's all holding those chemical, physical, and biological reactions together. So as I mentioned, soil porosity is an important part of this. And soil porosity is one of those things that is at that nexus, because you have the activity of soil biology that can help to form soil aggregates or pellets in the soil. And then you have that open space that's created between those aggregates and the mineral particles. And that open space is that pore space. So that's a physical space, physical differentiation in the environment. And you can have different types of biological and chemical activities that are going to be occurring here in that open space. But it's really important to be having more porosity in our soil environment, because that's going to help to drive a lot of the activities and building up the resiliency in the soil environment and its ability to respond to various types of climatic events. So what really is soil health? Been talking for a while, and now I'm kind of getting to the heart of it all, right? It's supposed to be about healthy soil. Soil health is the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And it's that continued capacity to function that is really important, because that is what it is that we're looking for. We want to continue function in that system. We want to make sure that function, we want to make sure that the chemistry is working the way that we need it to, so that plants have the nutrients when they need to have the nutrients, that there's the porosity that needs to be there for water movement and gas exchange. All of these different types of things that are important to the functionality of the soil environment. We want that activity to continue to occur no matter what the season is, no matter what time of the year it is. We want that to have that continuous capacity, that continuous function. And so one of the ways we can do this is by working with soil biology. And so the NRCS, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, has put together some principles for how you might be able to unlock your soil's potential for building up health. And so these principles are enlarged here. Basically, we want to minimize soil disturbance. We want to energize with diversity. We want to keep the soil covered, and we want to maximize living roots. So what really do these things mean? Essentially, we want to reduce the amount of tillage so we can utilize things like cover crops, composting, and mulch. We can manage livestock appropriately, so we're reducing the amount of soil disturbance. Doesn't mean we're going to be eliminating soil disturbance. Soil needs to be naturally disturbed. We've had soils that have had animals moving across the soil environment since animals have first evolved. We've had soil organisms that have been a part of disturbing and moving around soil particles since soil was first created. So we need to have a certain level of soil disturbance. What we want to do is we don't want that to be excessive amount of disturbance, because excessive amount of disturbance is going to lead to more erosion and more erosive forces. We want to energize with diversity. We want to make sure that we have a diverse diet going to the soil food web. The soil microbiome is similar to our own gut microbiome. As we well know, in our own gut microbiome, if we don't have a very diverse diet, we will end up having an upset stomach, because the microorganisms, the fungi and the bacteria in our gut, are not going to be very happy with us. What we want to do is we want to have a great level of diversity in that system. We want to make sure that we've got the diversity that is going to be feeding a number of different organisms. And that diversity is really good at being able to maintain a number of different organisms growing at different times, which is going to allow for more continuous capacity to function. We're going to do that by diversifying and lengthening the crop rotation. We can utilize cover crops. And then we can also energize with diversity or insert diversity in the soil microbiome itself by utilizing compost, which is going to bring in some different microorganisms. We want to make sure that the soil is protected. We want to make sure that the force of raindrops or wind blowing across the surface of the soil is not going to be a destructive force. We found that it is estimated essentially that roughly on a per acre basis, just a gentle rainfall can be equal to about 20 tons of TNT hitting the soil surface. So when we talk about losing 2 billion metric tons of topsoil, it's not that hard to imagine that that's very possible. So what we want to do is we want to reduce tillage so we don't have a lot of bare soil. We don't have a lot of fine soil particles that are more easily eroded. We want to make sure that we're going to be retaining residue between harvest and the growth of things like cover crops. We want to utilize things like compost and mulch on the surface of the soil to help protect that soil surface. And one of the most important things that we can do is actually to maximize living roots. We want to keep a plant growing as long as possible, because that's going to be the way in which we're going to be driving more carbon into the soil environment. And one of the ways in which we can do that is by utilizing cover crops. We're going to utilize crops that are going to have both long season and short season in the rotation. We're making sure that we've always got something growing. We've utilized some things here at the Rodale Institute where we have perennial and annual phases in the same landscape. And then you can also utilize livestock in order to be able to maximize more of your living roots. So you're utilizing a perennial phase and you're keeping that perennial phase in vegetative growth. It's not going reproductive and stopping its growth pattern. You want to keep it growing and keep it putting more carbon below ground and into the rooting environment. So one of the ways in which we can address what's going on in our soil environment is actually to look at the soil food web and really think about the root of the problem as being the root of the solution. The root of the problem is that we don't have enough carbon in our soils. Our soils are carbon depleted. That, I believe, is the one problem that we have in agriculture. And so what we need to do in order to be able to solve that problem is to get more living roots. And so when you look at the soil food web diagram here, you see these very broad categories of different types of organisms that exist in the food web. And they're all interdependent upon each other. They're either feeding off of each other as in predator and prey relationships, or they're feeding off of each other's waste. But if you look at where this food web starts, it all starts with the plants. That first trophic level is the photosynthesizer. You need to be able to have photosynthesis to get this food web started. And so the more you have photosynthesis, the better off it is that you're going to be able to be. The better you're going to be able to get the system functioning. The more you're going to be able to see these positive results in the system. And so if we wanted to look at all of the different relationships and all of the different interactions of all of the different types of organisms that you would have out there in the soil food web, you actually would be able to draw all of these interactions, but you wouldn't be able to see any writing on this slide because there are so many different organisms. There are millions of different species, all interacting in hundreds to thousands to millions of different ways. And so all of those arrows would just fill the page up. If you think about the tree of life, it's the diagram of the tree of life, and we as humans are a branch off of animals, the eukaryotes. And in the soil environment, there are actually representatives of pretty much every other species. So you have representatives from all of these other branches that can exist in that soil environment. And what that does is that huge diversity allows for a lot of resiliency and redundancy of function. Meaning that when it's too cold or too hot or too wet or too dry or too salty, or there's just not the perfect conditions for one organism, there's the perfect conditions for another organism. So somebody is always going to be able to function and grow in that environment. And you may think of these organisms as really small and not being able to play a very big role on a global landscape. You're talking about something that is, so incredibly tiny. How can that really affect me personally? But the largest organisms in the world are actually microscopic. Yes, it's true. The largest organisms in the world are microscopic fungi. The largest one currently existing is over 2,200 acres. It is in Oregon State and growing into Northern California. And it's at least 2,400 years old. And so we can see that if we leave these organisms in an environment, they're able to grow and flourish and expand and impact a huge amount of the landscape. And one of the ways in which these organisms, again, are connected is through that first trophic level. They're connected back to the plant through basic photosynthesis. And what we're really trying to do in our systems, what it is that is really going to be the difference between you making money or not making money in your production system, is banking soil carbon, putting carbon in the bank. That's what it is that you want to do. And you do that by increasing the amount of photosynthetic activity that you have. Capturing sunlight energy, taking CO2 and water, and having the plants transform them into C6H12O6. That's the chemical formula for sugars. And those sugars are what is going to be able to provide to the plant what the plant needs to be able to grow, all of the building blocks of the plant are going to contain a carbon backbone. Most of the life on planet Earth is carbon-based. It's going to contain a carbon backbone. And that carbon comes either directly or indirectly from this photosynthetic activity. So those organisms, that largest fungus in the world, that large organism has a carbon backbone to all of its cells. All of its microscopic cells have a carbon backbone to them. All of the enzymes and the proteins that are part of that organism have a carbon backbone to them. And so that's how carbon gets into the system, is through photosynthetic activity. And so the energy, the true value of the system is that carbon, that energy that's captured in carbon that's going to be buried in your soil bank. And when you have more soil, when you have more carbon banked in your soil, when you have more soil itself, that's that carbon component to things, building up soil organic matter. It's not a lot of the weight of the soil. Most of the weight of the soil is the mineral component, but it controls more than 90% of the functionality. So again, as we talk about soil health, that's that continued capacity to function. The more soil organic matter that you have in the system, the more functionality you can have to that system. You can have the ability to bind both cations and anions, have that ability to be able to hold on to both positives and negative charges. So you can hold on to nitrates and you can hold on to potassium at the same time. You're able to bind phosphates and able to bind calcium and magnesium and iron, so that you're able to hold on to those nutrients in an exchangeable fashion, so that when the plant needs them, they can be released and provided to the plant when those plants have the need. Rather than the synthetic fertilizers, that those are nutrients that are available to the plant, but those nutrients are going to go away. They don't stay in that form for the whole entire growing season. So as we saw, when the systems weren't drought tolerant, if those nutrients were gone and there wasn't a lot of water, soil water, to be able to get what little nutrients were left in the soil environment to move to the roots, then the plant started to become stressed. So what we want to do is we want to build up that soil structure, and we want to be able to have that exchangeable nutrient bank that we have there. The other thing with soil organic matter is that it builds up the soil volume itself. We're going to actually be growing soil from the top down. We're going to be able to increase the volume of our soils. If you've ever looked, many of the crop fields you'll see, compared to the fence rows, you actually have to step down to get into the field. And part of the reason is because our soils have collapsed. We've lost the organic matter, and so we've lost that volume, and the minerals are now collapsed on top of each other. The minerals are going to be tightly collapsed next to each other, whereas the organic matter is like a sponge, and so you're going to have a greater level of volume in that case. So it's really important to look at a system and try and essentially bank carbon. We want to put more carbon into the soil environment. And what that's going to do is that's going to increase or improve biological activity. It's going to increase infiltration rates, water holding capacity, water quality. The soil itself is a natural filtration system. In fact, the best filters, commercial filters, are carbon-based filters. And the reason is because the soil itself is a natural filtration system. We're going to improve the efficiency of water use. We're going to improve the efficiency and cycling of nutrients. We're going to be able to store those nutrients for when the plant needs them. We're going to improve soil structure and soil tilth. We're going to be able to hang on to nutrients and exchange them for when the plant needs them. We're going to decrease soil erosion, soil compaction, and air and water pollution. So we're able to utilize this diverse soil food web, all of these different organisms that you see here, both macroscopic and microscopic. Things you can see with the naked eye and things that you have to look at with a microscope in order to be able to see. And they're all going to be functioning in this environment in order to be able to, again, provide the function for soil health. The biology of the soil is this organic living component, and there are billions of different organisms representing millions of different species. It's said that in a handful of healthy soil, there are more organisms than the number of people who ever lived on planet Earth. And the weight of those organisms in the top 6 inches in an acre is equivalent to anywhere between 5 to 20,000 pounds, depending on the health of the soil. So essentially what you're doing is, if you have healthy soil, you are having to feed the equivalent of somewhere around roughly 17 to 23, 25, depending on the size of the animal, 17 to about 23 cows every day, all day long, every day of the year. That is what we're feeding with the organisms that we have in the soil. And it's difficult to assess some of these organisms that we'll have in our soil because their communities will vary. You may have organisms in one spot here, and then you may move to another spot here and have a completely different community, or maybe not even any organisms that you would have in that other spot, because they respond to conditions. They respond especially to food and food availability. So the things that we're doing in the principles we want to apply are the things that are going to enhance the amount of food that they're going to have access to. We have bacteria in the soil environment. On Earth, there's roughly 5 non-million, or 5 times 10 to the 30 bacteria. Most of the world's biomass is in bacteria. And the total number of bacteria in a gram of soil, in about a teaspoon of soil, ranges from millions to billions, depending again on health of the soil. And the diversity of those bacteria, their sizes and their shapes and their activities, is incredibly diverse. You have bacteria that feed on organic matter. They're able to cycle the nutrients that are locked up in organic matter, that are able to store and cycle nitrogen. You have bacteria that have nitrogen as part of their bodies, and that's a way of storing and cycling nitrogen when those bacteria get eaten. And then you also have bacteria that can both asymbiotically, meaning not in a relationship with a plant or another organism, and symbiotically, so in a relationship with a plant or another organism. In this case, symbiotically usually refers to things like rhizobium bacteria, but symbiotically fix nitrogen. And so between asymbiotic and symbiotic nitrogen fixation, you can account for about the same amount of nitrogen fixation as we do synthetically. So when people say there's no way that biology could replace what we need to have on a synthetic level, if we were to maximize the efficiencies of these systems and really work on an effort to build up soil health and soil biology, we would be able to utilize these systems in a much more efficient manner, and we would be able to account for all of the nitrogen needs of the plant. You also have bacteria that help to break down minerals and release nutrients, such as phosphorus. Most of our soils are not phosphorus depleted. Most of our soils have an issue with phosphorus because the phosphorus is not in an available form. So we need the bacteria to help to put the phosphorus in that available form. We have bacteria that can help to stabilize soil, help to make soil aggregates. And we have bacteria that help to decompose various types of pesticides. Now you also have soil fungi. And the soil fungi play a number of different roles in the system as well. You have fungi that you have thousands to tens of thousands of different species. And you have organisms that are referred to as parasites, saprophytes, or mutualists. And so most of the fungi that are out there are considered to be saprophytes. They feed on organic matter that is difficult to break down, such as crop residues. And then you have parasites. Some of these are going to be parasites that are going to attack foliar material. Some of them are going to attack other fungi or other organisms, including nematodes, microarthropods, and macroarthropods. And you have plant mutualists. You have fungi that are going to trade nutrients, primarily phosphorus for carbon. They need the carbon from the plant, so they're going to provide that exchange in order to be able to get their needs satisfied. You have fungi, the saprophytes, that are the decomposers or nutrient transporters. They're going to store nitrogen in their bodies and then release that nitrogen upon decomposition. You have the fungi that are going to help to stabilize soil structure, forming soil aggregates. And these fungi, if you look, you can see here, their bodies for most of the fungi are these thread-like bodies that are the fungal hyphae or the mycelium. And these thread-like bodies are particularly impacted by management such as plowing or tillage. And so you want to be able to be cognizant of the different types of management tools that you use and how that's going to be impacting the amount of fungi that you have in the soil. Now you have these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. These are organisms that I talked about that were part of helping to form soil. You have these organisms that take roughly about 4 to 30% of the carbon from the plant, and they will actually take that carbon and utilize that to grow their bodies. These fine threads that will go out into the soil environment and be able to pick up nutrients from an area that the plant roots normally can't absorb the nutrients. So the plant roots will absorb the nutrients around their roots and around their root hairs, as you can see in this diagram. But on the other side of that dotted line, that's going to be difficult for the plant roots to absorb those nutrients. So the fungal hyphae will go out there and be able to obtain those nutrients. And they will then out there form soil aggregates. They create those pellets that are in the soil. And those pellets that are in the soil are like little microbial towns or little microbial communities that they have there. And what they will do out in that environment is they will create a mycorrhizosphere or a zone out there in that aggregate where you can have bacteria that would be releasing phosphorus. And they'll be able then to take up that phosphorus and deliver that right inside the roots. So the hyphae, like a pipeline, will go from out in the soil, from out in the aggregate, and will follow, you can follow the path, and it will go right inside the root. And then you'll have the hyphae where it will exchange the nutrients inside that rooting environment. And the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi can obtain roughly about 90% of the nitrogen and phosphorus needs that a plant will have. And it does this through the activity of this phosphate solubilizing bacteria. And in fact, these phosphate solubilizing bacteria have worked so hard in maximizing the efficiency of this relationship that they will actually grow and colonize along the hyphae. They'll attach themselves to the hyphae of the mycorrhizal fungi so that they can be right there. They'll get some of the carbon in that mycorrhizosphere environment or right outside of the hyphae. They'll get some of the carbon that came from the plant. So the fungus will give carbon to phosphate solubilizing bacteria. That phosphate solubilizing bacteria will use that carbon to then be able to create the enzymes that are needed to be able to solubilize phosphorus, and then they'll be able to release that phosphorus. That phosphorus can then get taken up by the fungus and the fungus will then transport that phosphorus back inside the plant roots. You have different species of mycorrhizal fungi that can do different types of activities. And it isn't like with rhizobium bacteria where you have a host-fungus relationship that you need to have a specific fungus with a specific host. This is actually a relationship in which you can have a number of different types of fungi that can colonize the same host, but you'll have mixed cultures of the fungi, mixed species that are far more efficient because they can do a number of different types of activities. And you can also have relationships in which you can have the fungus connecting various types of plants together. So you could have a non-legume plant trade something like carbon and phosphorus to trading the phosphorus essentially to a legume plant for nitrogen that the legume plant will make from the bacteria that's colonizing the legume plant's roots. And the mycorrhizal fungus will actually connect both the legume and the non-legume plant together. It's a far more efficient way of being able to manage nutrients in this system. Now, some of the other organisms you'll have in the soil are things like nematodes. And for the most part, a lot of us think of nematodes as being bad. We don't want to have nematodes in our soils. But in reality, most of the nematodes are actually not bad organisms. Most of the nematodes are very important in predator and prey relationships. You have most of the nematodes that are non-pathogenic. They are going to feed on fungi and they're going to feed on bacteria. And in the process of doing that, that means they're a very important part of the nitrogen cycle because they're going to consume bacteria and fungi. And when they do that, that's going to release nitrogen that was locked up in the bodies of these organisms. You also have relationships, predator and prey relationships, like you'll see here in this middle picture, where you have fungi that will form these loops. These are nematode trapping fungi. And they'll form these loops and they'll attract the nematode into the loop. And then the cytoplasmic, the fluid material, the liquid inside the cells will move towards that loop, and that'll cause the cells to swell, so the loop will close, and it will trap the nematode there. And then it will digest that nematode and eat that nematode. So it's a way of, again, being able to control various types of relationships. Now, because nematodes are reliant often upon fungi and bacteria, activities that affect fungi and bacteria will affect nematode populations. So excessive tillage will decrease their food sources. If you don't have good amounts of organic matter, because a lot of bacteria will feed on organic matter, that will also affect your food source. The other thing is that pesticides, synthetic pesticides, oftentimes will kill nematodes. So you have nematicides that will directly kill nematodes, but you can have other pesticides that will also affect various types of nematodes. Now, another group of organisms are the protozoa. You have things like amoebas and ciliates and flagellates. And so you have these organisms that are in the soil. In order for them to be able to move, they move with hairs on their surface or whip-like tails that allow them to be able to move. Or they will move by moving their cellular contents like amoebas do. They are dependent upon water films, however, in order to be able to move in this environment. And like with nematodes, they're an important part of the nitrogen cycle because they consume a lot of bacteria. They're going to be eating a huge amount of bacteria, and when they do that, the waste that they give off is nitrogen in the plant available form. So it's a way of being able to address the plant needs for nitrogen. Now, the other organisms that we have in the soil environment are things like microarthropods. These are microscopic insects. You have mites and columbulas or springtails. You have things like termites. You'll have these organisms that will be in the soil environment, and what their big role is they are the decomposers or shredders of organic matter. They break it down into little itty bitty pieces. They're the chewers. And they'll break it down into little itty bitty pieces so that the bacteria can actually then break it down even further. So the bacteria will be decomposing that organic matter. So in reference to things like termites, termites don't actually eat wood. Termites will chew wood. And then in the process of chewing that wood, the bacteria that are in their guts, just like bacteria that are in our guts, will take that material that's been chewed up into little pieces and break that down. And then once they've decomposed and broken that large particles that have been shredded into small particles, they'll break those down into the individual elements that then provide for the nutrition for the termites, or in our case, provide for our nutrition. So you need to be able to have these various types of organisms in the soil in order to be able to allow for bacteria to flourish. Now these are microscopic insects, so insecticides will kill them. They're also impacted a lot by tillage because that displaces a lot of organic matter, so it changes some of their food sources. And again, they're an important part of the nitrogen cycle because that modifies the types of bacteria that they're going to have access to. Now, one of the other organisms that I wanted to talk about this afternoon are the earthworms. So you have poor soils that can contain about 250,000 earthworms on a per acre basis, but you can have good soils or healthy soils that contain close to 2 million earthworms on a per acre basis. And the earthworms are very important for the soil environment. They're good for nutrient cycling. They can gather up organic matter that's at the surface and pull that down into the soil environment so that it can be delivered to the microarthropods and broken down and be delivered to bacteria and fungi. And they're also important because their castings, you can see in this picture, that are left behind, their castings can contain a high content of humus, high in nitrogen, high in phosphorus, and high in potash. In addition, you can see in one of the top pictures, you can see earthworms themselves, but then you can also see a trail that was left behind. This was in a soil kit that we had out at the Rodale Institute farm in the farming systems trial. And you can see this trail that was left in the V horizon from the earthworms tunneling through. And this is a much darker, richer trail that was left behind that tunnel that was there. And that's because it contains that higher level of humus. So you'll get bacteria and fungi that will colonize that environment and grow in that environment. So here you have a representation of all of the different types of, the different colors represent the different species of earthworms. But then you can see all of the different types of tunnels and burrowing systems that the earthworms can have on a square meter or a square yard basis. So what we really want to do in these systems is we want to utilize the organisms themselves. So I said we want to minimize soil disturbance. We want to have biological tillage. We want to have the organisms churning up that soil environment. So essentially what we're looking for in the future is a brown revolution or a soil revolution. We need to use biologically based regenerative organic agricultural practices that focus on feeding soil biota and maintaining their habitats, making sure that organisms are fed and that they have a good home, and doing that by maintaining living roots, keeping a plant growing as long as possible, keeping the soil covered with living plants, crop residues, compost, and/or mulch, energizing with crop diversity through crop rotation, cover crops, companion cropping, or perennial phases, and minimizing soil disturbance. And that's going to allow us to create healthy soils, utilizing healthy biology to provide for healthy soils. With that, I'd like you to stay tuned for future webinars presented by the Rodale Institute, and to remember that a nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. Thank you, and good afternoon.